All right, welcome back. I am positive you are sick of hearing from me today. This is my last video, and you won't have to look at me again until next week, hopefully. So, in thinking about the review and going back through, um, I did several things. I considered some of the feedback that students have shared. I've considered what actually was in the slides. I reviewed all the slides and then I reviewed all the readings. And I think some of the breakdown is essentially where there are differences in learning styles. And I did not just simply replicate the readings in lectures. I treated the lectures as an overview of main ideas and applied examples, and the readings did that in more detail to a degree. Well, they absolutely did in more detail. It's the whole point of having readings. And I'm wondering if it's possible that the material that was covered in the readings that was not explicitly discussed in lecture slides, because I never write my slides like paragraphs. I tend to just use bullet points and have main ideas, that if you needed to be able to review that information again, that's where some of the breakdown was. So I am creating this video in order to integrate both the slides and the readings, okay? To see if I can fill in those gaps and help. I'm going to do it for weeks 1 through 5, okay? So in week 1, we asked what might have felt like a basic question. Why study research in social work? But this wasn't really about defending the existence of a research course. It was about something much bigger. Week 1 was about how we know what we think we know and why that matters ethically in human service settings. If this week felt abstract, that's completely normal. We were working at the level of epistemology, how knowledge is formed, before we moved into methods. Bear with me. I have to kind of see myself. If I can't see myself, then I feel like I'm not talking to anybody. So I'm moving so I can see myself. Anyway, so we were working at the level of epistemology, how knowledge is formed, before we moved into the real meat and potatoes of methods, right? So now that we're 5 weeks in, I want to reorganize so that you can see why it matters. Ways of knowing. We began by talking about 2 very common ways of knowing: agreement reality, which is what we know because trusted others say it is true. Dr. Pilkey told me this, so therefore it is true, right? My supervisor at work told me this, so therefore it is true. And experiential reality, what we know because we've seen it ourselves. I've seen this in practice time and time again, and therefore it is true, it is real. Both are valuable. In fact, you rely on both constantly in practice, but both are also vulnerable to error. Agreement reality can perpetuate harmful traditions. Experiential reality can distort our expectations, or be distorted by our expectations is a better way to say that. Week 1 introduced the idea that good intentions are not enough. Experience alone is not enough. Authority alone is not enough. And that is where science enters. So what makes the scientific method different? We introduced the scientific method using the Trout mnemonic, TROUT. Tentative, all knowledge is open to question. Replication, findings must be repeated. Okay, we must see replication. Observation, evidence must be systematic and empirical. Unbiased, we actively have to guard against our own preferences. Transparency, others must be able to see exactly how we reached our conclusions. This matters in applied human service settings because when we say a problem works, when we say a client is improving, when we say a policy is effective, We are making claims that affect real lives. Scientific thinking protects clients from overconfidence, tradition masquerading as evidence, interventions that feel helpful but are not, or worse, interventions that actually cause harm. There are some common errors in human inquiry. We also examined how humans naturally reason and where that reasoning goes wrong. We discussed overgeneralization, drawing big conclusions from small samples. Selective observation, noticing only the cases that confirm what we already believe. Ex post facto hypothesizing, explaining away our findings after the fact. Or ego involvement, defending our ideas simply because they are our own ideas. These are not character flaws, they're human tendencies, and this is important. The scientific method is not about being smarter than others. It's about creating structures that protect us from our own cognitive blind spots. Then we talked about pseudoscience versus science, and Freud did a lot for psychology in terms of shifting their whole profession from pseudoscience to science. Pseudoscience are things that look scientific but actually violate scientific norms. The warning signs include extreme claims, testimonials instead of systematic data, resistance to disconfirming our evidence. Remember, we seek to disprove our belief, not prove it. Overgeneralization. Oh, this is true for these 10 people, therefore it must be true for everyone. Attacking critics rather than engaging with evidence. Why did we spend time on this? Because as future practitioners in human service settings, you will be exposed to numerical interventions, popular training workshops, policy claims, and agency traditions. Your ethical obligation is not to accept or reject them emotionally. Your obligation is to evaluate the evidence. Then we shifted into evidence-based practice. And this is crucial. It's not a list of approved interventions. It is a decision-making process that integrates best available research evidence, practitioner expertise, and client values and context. Evidence-based practice applies across micro, meso, and macro practice settings. And here's the key shift. You're not just consumers of research. In this course, you are becoming producers of evidence in an applied setting, hence the group research project. So why this matters for your group research project. Week 1 was not theoretical filler. It was laying the ethical foundation for what you are now doing. In your group program evaluation, you are preventing overgeneralization by collecting systematic data. You are guarding against selective observation by using structured measures. You are practicing transparency by documenting your methods. You're integrating multiple ways of knowing through a mixed methods approach. When you triangulate themes after AI-assisted coding, you will be engaging in replication and peer review in a miniature form. You are operationalizing the scientific method in a real human service context. That is applied research. If you remember one thing from week 1, let it be this. Scientific thinking is not separate from ethical practice in social work. It is part of ethical practice. Without systematic evidence, we risk confusing what feels right with what actually works. And in human service settings, that distinction matters. In week 2, we shifted from asking why research matters to asking what actually shapes the way research is done. So if week 1 was about epistemology and ethics, week 2 was about structure and influence. This week may have felt terminology heavy: theory, hypotheses, deduction, induction, idiographic, nomothetic, internal validity, external validity. But all of those concepts connect to one idea. Research is a structured decision-making process influenced by theory, values, and real-world constraints. So let's reorganize that. You saw a diagram of the research process in the reading. hopefully. I'm assuming you looked. It begins with identifying a problem and then formulating a research question, then moves to choosing a design, selecting measures, collecting data, analyzing data, drawing conclusions, and reporting findings. But importantly, it's not linear. You loop back. If funding falls through, you redesign. If measures don't capture the concept well, you revise. If findings raise new questions, the cycle begins again. This looping structure is essential to understanding your group project. You're not following a checklist. I mean, you are, but your checklist is forcing you into a loop. You're entering this research cycle. So theory and values shape research. Theory helps us explain patterns. Without theory, research becomes random data collection or basic research, which is what we say when we're just essentially exploring for the sake of discovery. For example, the textbook itself illustrated how theory guides what we measure, what outcomes we expect, and how we interpret change. Theory helps us move from something happened to here is why we think it happened. But values also shape research. For example, is a child welfare program successful because families stay together or because children are safe? The answer depends on what we value. Research cannot decide values for us, but it can test whether programs achieve the outcomes we value. This matters in your applied evaluation project. Your choice of outcome measures reflects what you believe matters most. Hypotheses, variables, and attributes. We also covered this. This is where some students likely felt lost. A hypothesis is a statement predicting a relationship between variables. A variable is a concept that can vary. Attributes are the categories within a variable. I just said a mouthful. So let's clarify. An example, a variable could be gender. The attributes of the variable gender would be male, female, non-binary, and so forth. The variable could be satisfaction. The attributes of that variable's satisfaction might be high, medium, or low. In explanatory research, we often distinguish, remember this is explaining, an independent variable versus a dependent variable. The independent variable is the potential cause. The dependent variable is the potential effect or outcome. But remember, in social science, causation is always probabilistic, or you could think of it in terms of likelihood, which brings us to the next key idea, the likelihood or probabilistic knowledge. In human behavior, almost nothing is certain. We speak in terms of likelihood. For example, poverty increases the probability of homelessness, but it does not guarantee it. Intervention, A, may increase the likelihood of improvement. It does not guarantee improvement for every client. This probabilistic nature of knowledge can feel uncomfortable, but it is more ethical than pretending certainty. When you analyze your group data, you'll be looking for patterns, not guarantees. And what about deduction and induction? Week 2 introduced two logical systems. Deductive reasoning, which is theory, develops hypothesis, which leads to data. And then inductive reasoning, where data identifies a pattern, which leads to the development of a theory. Most real research moves back and forth between the two. In your project, when you start with literature and propose expectations, that's deductive, right? When you conduct thematic coding and allow patterns to emerge, that's inductive. You're doing both. Ideographic versus nomothetic. This distinction matters deeply in social work. Ideographic explanation is understanding one case in depth. Nomothetic explanation is identifying general patterns across many cases. So research falls into one of these two categories: ideographic, individual level; nomothetic, group, cohort kind of level. In practice, you think ideographically. In research, you often think nomothetically. Your group evaluation will generate nomothetic findings. But as practitioners, you must always interpret those findings ideographically when applying them to individual cases. How does what we understand about this group at large affect what I'm thinking about and working on with my client at an interpersonal level, on the ideographic level, right? We also introduced some information about design decisions and validity. Things like units of analysis, time dimension, causation, internal validity, the confidence in being able to claim cause and effect. External validity, the ability to generalize results to entire populations. Internal validity asks, did X actually cause Y? I'm sorry, hold on just a moment. Hey! Don't make me get the buzzer. Can't believe I just said that in front of you all. I'm sorry. Shh. Recording at home with dogs. It doesn't zap them. It just startles them and a high-pitched noise. All right. Where was I? Internal validity. Internal validity asks, did X actually cause Y? External validity asks, does this apply beyond the people who participated in this study, our sample? There's often a trade-off between the two. In applied human service settings, perfect experimental control is rare, which means design always involves compromise. Timing, funding, access to individuals, they all shape what is feasible. That's not a flaw. Unfortunately, it is a reality. The closer we get to creating a perfect experimental design, the farther away from the application to a real lived experience we become, which is why there really is no true perfect research design. Trade-off is required. If you remember one thing from week 2, let it be this. Research design is a series of structured decisions shaped by theory, values, logic, and feasibility. It is not neutral. It is not automatic. It is intentional. And you are now making those decisions yourselves. In week 3, we moved into the ethics and politics of social work research. So if week 1 established why scientific thinking matters, and week 2 showed how research is structured, week 3 asked a harder question. What are we ethically allowed to do when studying human beings? This week is not about bureaucracy. It's really about power. And social work research always involves power. So why research ethics exist? We began with some historical examples, including the Tuskegee syphilis study. In that study, hundreds of Black men were deceived and denied treatment for decades. Those historical failures are why IRB's, internal review boards, exist. Ethical oversight did not emerge naturally. It emerged in response to direct harm. So when you encounter IRB forms, consent language, review processes, remember, they are institutional responses to past abuse. They are imperfect, but they are protective. So IRBs, institutional review boards, they review studies involving human subjects to ensure risks are minimized, participants are protected, benefits outweigh the potential harms, and consent is properly obtained. IRBs are necessary, but they are also imperfect, as we discussed in class. They involve human judgment. Reasonable people may disagree about risk levels, and sometimes IRBs can be overcautious. But that tension is part of research practice. We have to find our way through it. Voluntary participation and informed consent is something else we talked about. One of the core principles that we discussed, in fact. Informed consent must include what the study involves, potential risks, limits of confidentiality, and the right to withdraw. And participation must always be voluntary. We can never force people into participating in the research. If you are, you definitely did not outline that in your IRB application. But power dynamics complicate things like consent to voluntarily participate in a study. If you're researching students in your own class, which unfortunately for us, we are, you're studying yourselves. And I have already noted in the other class that their participation is completely voluntary, so I don't know how many will actually participate. Or clients in an agency, or prisoners, or economically vulnerable participants. Is participation ever fully voluntary? This is not a rhetorical question. It's a real ethical tension. And as social workers, you are uniquely positioned to see how vulnerability affects choice. If someone is, for example, economically vulnerable and you offer them a large sum of money, they're more inclined to do something that they don't want to do just for the sake of having the money, right? This is why we say power is involved and that you are uniquely positioned to see how vulnerability affects choice. Now we have the no harm principle. Research should not harm participants. That sounds simple, but harm can be physical, psychological, social, reputational, legal, or even relational. Harm can occur during data collection, data analysis, or reporting. And I talked about that a little bit. Labeling a group as high risk without nuance can stigmatize communities. Ethical research requires anticipating those downstream consequences. Something that came up on the quiz that we also talked about in the slides and was in the readings was anonymity versus confidentiality. They go together but have their differences as well. Those terms are often confused. Anonymity, true anonymity, means even the researcher cannot link responses to individuals. And that's what I often strive for in my research because I work with a very vulnerable underage sample, right? I'm always working with children. So anonymity is very important to me. Confidentiality means that the researcher can link responses to the participants, but they promise not to disclose those identities. Here's the issue, though. There's limits. You may be legally required to report child abuse, imminent harm to self or others. Those limits must be disclosed in consent forms. Ethical clarity requires transparency about limits, not to mention the fact about data breaches, which is another reason why I always shoot for anonymity in addressing confidentiality. So when I talk about confidentiality, I'm always like, even I can't link you to anybody else. So even if the data was somehow breached and we were hacked and breached or something like that, then there's no way anybody could ever know who is who. I have no files linking my participants to their data. So this means that we also need to talk about deception and trade-offs, which we also went through in the text. Some studies involve deception. The textbook example of participant observation in hospice settings was one of them, illustrated how researchers sometimes justify deception for a long-term benefit. But deception must meet very strict criteria. It must be necessary. It must have minimal risk to participants. The participants must be debriefed, told about it afterward, and it must be approved by the IRB. There's no formula for weighing benefit versus cost in this situation. It involves judgment, and judgment always involves values. Now, the right to service versus responsibility to evaluate. This is one of the most important ethical tensions in applied social work research. If we want to test whether a service works, we may need a comparison group. But does withholding a service violate a client's right to care? There are ways to reduce this tension. Waiting list designs, for example. We will have you wait for 6 weeks before you can access the intervention. They'll be collecting data for that entire time. One group gets the intervention, the other one waits for 6 weeks. At the end of the 6 weeks, they compare the two groups, and then the waiting list group is offered the intervention. Comparing new interventions to standard care, so at least the comparison group is still getting something. Ensuring no one is permanently denied services. This tension is directly relevant to program evaluation. It's not theoretical. It is structural. What about politics and power? The slides emphasize that research is political. Funding shapes research questions. Ideology shapes interpretation. Economic vulnerability shapes participation. Elliott's guinea pigging example highlights how paid research participants are often economically marginalized. Financial incentives can blur voluntariness, which is why we have to sort of balance, and we have to be able to argue effectively to an IRB why we elect to pay what we pay for incentives for participants. Because if they think the money is too much, they'll shoot it down. Ethics, power, and inequality are inseparable in terms of research. Social workers can't ignore that. Now, what about online research? We talked about this too, and the ethics around this. Gupta raised new ethical concerns in internet-based research. Privacy expectations are unclear. Public versus private boundaries blur. Consent may be ambiguous. Data security becomes critical. I mean, gosh, during COVID, there were random people jumping in on Zoom sessions and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. A lot of virtual therapy sessions are done in Zoom settings. If there's a hacker out there, they'll find a way to break a system somehow. The digital environment complicates these traditional ethical norms. So if you remember one thing from week 3, remember this. Ethical research is about protecting people in systems shaped by inequality and power. IRBs are tools. Consent forms are tools. Procedures are tools. But ethics ultimately depends on reflexivity, transparency, and professional judgment. Now, in week 4, we moved into problem formulation and reviewing literature. If the earlier weeks felt theoretical, this week is where things start to feel real, because now the question becomes, what exactly are we studying? And here's something important. Many weak studies fail not because of bad statistics or poor ethics, but because the research question was unclear from the beginning. If this week felt harder than expected, that makes sense. Formulating a strong research question is one of the most cognitively demanding parts of research. It requires clarity, focus, and humility. So research topics versus research questions. It's important, right, that we made a distinction between this. A topic is not a research question. This comes directly from the text. In the slides, we talked about homelessness is a topic. High no-show rates in outpatient mental health services is a topic, but a research question must be narrow, specific, and answerable with observable evidence. For example, what client, agency, and structural factors predict missed appointments? That's a research question, not high no-show rates in outpatient mental health services. See the difference? A topic is broad and conceptual. A research question is precise and able to be investigated. This narrowing process can feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is a sign that you're doing real intellectual work. So don't feel bad or concerned about it. Purposes of research. The reading reminded us that research can serve multiple purposes. Exploration, description, explanation, evaluation, constructing measurement instruments. Each purpose implies a different design. So for example, let's walk through them. Exploration. What is happening here? Description. How much of this is happening? Explanation. Why is this happening? Evaluation. is this intervention effective? This is not just academic categorization. In your group evaluation projects, your research design questions must align with your purpose. If your purpose is evaluation, your question must allow you to assess effectiveness. If your purpose is descriptive, you cannot make causal claims. Clarity at this stage protects you later. So this leads us to the attributes of a good research question. Don't get me wrong, they're hard to do. And I see poor research questions all of the time, not just in class. I see them in real research all the time. The reading gives us several criteria. A strong research question is narrow and specific, answerable with evidence, relevant to decision making, it's feasible, and passes the most important so what test. The so what test is critical. If you cannot explain how the answer to your question would guide practice or policy, the question may need refinement. Social work research is applied. Utility matters. This doesn't mean every question must solve everything. It means it must connect to real decisions in human service settings, which leads us to feasibility and trade-offs. This is where many students experience tension. The reading emphasized feasibility, time, cost, access, ethics, and cooperation. You may design the ideal study, longitudinal, multi-site, large sample, meaning you're studying people over a period of time, taking multiple collections, you're taking it at multiple different locations, and you're collecting from a lot of people. But you're constrained by semester timelines, agency access, budget, IRB approval, participant recruitment. This is not failure. This is applied research reality. In your slides, we emphasized this clearly in the feasibility trade-off example. So ideal would be a 2-year longitudinal tracking. The constraint, limited funding. We don't have enough money to do that. Adaptation, be a short-term cohort study. The key teaching point was rigor must be balanced with feasibility. A feasible, well-executed study is stronger than an ambitious design that cannot be implemented. And this is particularly important in your group projects. You're learning how to make real-world methodological trade-offs. That is a professional skill involving others, hence the group in your group projects. Problem formulation should not happen in isolation. Involving colleagues, agencies, and stakeholders improves relevance, reduces resistance, increases feasibility, and strengthens design. This is especially relevant in human service settings. If the agency does not see value in your question, implementation becomes difficult. Applied research is collaborative by necessity. All right, literature reviews. The literature review is not a box to check at the end. It begins early and continues throughout the research process. And this is iterated very clearly in the text. In the slides, we talked a little bit more about this through examples, but the literature helps you avoid reinventing the wheel, identify validated measures, learn common predictors, anticipate paradoxes, avoid repeating ineffective strategies. It also sharpens your research question. Sometimes the literature reveals this question's already been answered, and other times it reveals this gap is exactly where we need to be focusing. For your group projects, the literature review is doing heavy lifting. It anchors your choices in cumulative knowledge. Practice integration. So your slides provided applied examples at micro and macro levels. This reinforces something critical. Problem formulation is not abstract. It shapes what you measure, what outcomes you track, what design you select, what claims you are allowed to make. In other words, your research question determines everything downstream. If you remember one thing from week 4, let it be this. Strong research begins with a well-formulated, feasible, practice-relevant question. Clarity at the beginning prevents confusion at the end. If you're still refining your question, that's not a problem. That's part of the process in research. In week 5, we moved into measurement, and this is often the week where students think this is where research gets technical. That's true, but it's also where research becomes powerful. Because once you have a strong research question, a feasible design, ethical safeguards in place, everything depends on whether your measures are trustworthy. If measurement is weak, conclusions are weak. If measurement is strong, your study has credibility. So let's reorganize week 5 into 3 big ideas. Measurement error. Measurement error occurs when the data that we collect doesn't accurately reflect the concept we're trying to measure. There are 2 main types: systematic error, which consistently pushes your measurement in one direction. Some examples are social desirability bias, leading questions, cultural bias, or biased record keeping. Can't always trust what other people have recorded. Systematic error creates distortion in the data. It threatens validity. Are we actually testing and studying what we intend to, right? Random error. Random error makes your measurement inconsistent. Some examples: respondents misunderstanding questions, fatigue halfway through a long survey, so they just quit or just start checking boxes, inconsistent raters. Random error creates instability. It threatens the reliability of the findings. This distinction matters. Systematic error equals bias. Random error equals inconsistency. Both weaken your conclusions, but in different ways. So this leads us to reliability. Reliability asks, if we measure this again under similar conditions, would we get the same result? Reliability is about consistency. And there are 3 common forms. Inter-rater reliability. Let's start there. Do different observers agree? If 2 clinicians rate the same client and disagree drastically, the measure lacks reliability. This is not just technical, it's an equity issue. For example, in child welfare risk assessments, inconsistent ratings can produce unequal treatment across families, and we often see this across ancestral lines. Test, retest reliability. That's another form. If the construct hasn't changed, does the score stay stable over time? This is important when evaluating change. If your scale fluctuates widely without intervention, you cannot trust it to detect real change, right? Internal consistency. This is the coefficient alpha, right? The Cronbach's alpha. Do the items on the scale hang together? Do they measure what we wanted to measure? And is it going to work the same consistently across the people? So if a depression scale includes feeling sad, crying, trouble sleeping, feeling hopeless, those items should correlate with each other. A coefficient alpha, or Cronbach's alpha, quantifies that consistency. And as I said in the lecture, it needs to be no less than 0.7. High internal consistency suggests the items are measuring the same underlying construct. So here's the reassuring piece. You're not expected to calculate alpha by hand. We're going to do that together using what we call applied statistics. We're going to have software do it for us. You are expected, though, to understand what it means. Reliability versus validity. So your slides made this distinction clearly. Reliable measures may be invalid. Valid measures require reliability. A bathroom scale that's set 10 pounds too light is reliable, but invalid. Although I might like that kind of invalidity. Consistency alone is not enough. Validity asks, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? This is deeper than reliability. You can be consistently wrong, right? Like the clock example I gave in the recorded lecture. There are several types of validity. Face validity. Does the measure appear on the surface to measure the concept? This is subjective, necessary but not sufficient. And usually this is done on the front end when a measure is being created. They'll get like a board a review board together of experts in the field and researchers to look at what they have pulled together and say, yes, we believe these items at face value are measuring the constructs, and sometimes they'll even use the DSM. Content validity. Does the measure cover the full domain of the concept? If you measure depression using only sadness, you are missing critical components. Content validity is about coverage, right? We have to consider more than sadness when we're thinking about depression. That's the idea of content validity. We'd have to think about sleep and changes in eating and fatigue. That would be the coverage necessary for good content validity. Then we have criterion-related validity. Does your measure correlate with an external standard? And this is the one, if you take clinical practice evaluation, that you'll learn how to assess. Does your new anxiety scale correlate with Beck's anxiety measure, right? Or the GAD-7? Those are external standards. And in theory, since they've already been proven to measure anxiety, then your new anxiety scale that you create as a researcher, if that's what you did, should, in theory, correlate strongly across the same person for their scores, right? They should relate to each other. Criterion validity is about comparison, and it's a way of confirming, yes, it's measuring what it's supposed to measure because, look, it's functioning exactly the same way as this other one that we trust. Construct validity is really about theory. Does your measure behave the way that theory predicts? Okay, and a lot of this came from the text. Does depression correlate with anxiety? Because we know depression and anxiety are like sisters or cousins. They often are comorbid and take turns. It's super fun for those of us that either suffer from chronic anxiety or depression because we're plagued by the other from time to time. Does it negatively correlate with self-esteem? What do I mean there? So as depression goes up and increases, do we see a decline in self-esteem? Because theoretically, that should be the case. Does it not correlate with unrelated constructs? Meaning, as your depression increases, it should not affect your favorite flavor of ice cream. There shouldn't be a relationship between those two things, right? So construct validity is about theoretical coherence and congruence. Triangulation. One of the most important applied takeaways from this particular module was triangulation. Using multiple methods to measure the same concept. If self-reports, observations, record reviews all converge, confidence then increases. This connects directly to your mixed methods group project. When you combine standardized measures with thematic coding and then triangulate across your group, you're actively strengthening the validity of your study. Well, you're each strengthening the validity of the shared full study. You're not just doing both quantitative and qualitative work. You are reducing systematic error. So the applied takeaway. The slides emphasized some applied examples using a single yes/no depression question versus a validated scale. Attendance as a flawed outcome measure. Inter-rater reliability as an equity issue. Policy metrics that measure volume instead of impact. Measurement is not abstract. It shapes narratives. Poor measurement can make effective programs look ineffective, reinforce deficit models, or incentivize the wrong outcomes. Good measurement supports ethical, just, and effective practice. If you remember one thing from week 5, let it be this. Measurement quality determines whether your conclusions are trustworthy. Reliability protects you from inconsistency. Validity protects you from distortion. Both are professional responsibilities in applied research. Now let's bridge this forward. At this point in the course, you now have epistemological grounding, design logic, ethical awareness, problem formulation skills, and some measurement literacy. You're entering the meat and potatoes phase, but you now have the intellectual scaffolding to handle it. If parts of weeks 4 or 5 still feel heavy, that is completely normal. Measurement is one of the hardest conceptual areas for new researchers, but you do not need perfection. You need awareness and intentionality, and you're building both. The most important thing that I want to say is there are things about this assignment, this group project, study research project that we're doing, that are intentionally going to highlight gaps and measurement issues. Okay? So as you're working through this, I know that they are embedded in there. That is intentional. Because I need you to not only see a perfect study, I need you to see where failures can happen so that you then can start to have ideas about how it would need to be addressed. Now, in your case, the biggest gaps are going to be that you couldn't find standardized measures to address absolutely every single one of the attributes of the variables and constructs that you're measuring, right? And that's just because of what they are. And that's okay, all right? We are addressing them the best way that we can. We're being transparent about it, or you will be transparent about it when you write about it in your methods. But in the end, when we look at the data, some of you are going to find things where you go, oh, you know what? This question should have been worded differently. Oh, you know what? We should have asked this question. Oh, you know what? The fact that we didn't have a standardized measure affected the reliability of how these questions were answered over time from the participants in the study, blah, blah, blah. You'll be able to see it in real time, okay? So again, I don't want you worried about the outcome of the study. That last, we're going to present our findings thing, which you probably haven't even gotten to thinking about yet, although there's some type A's in here, so you probably have. I just want you focused on engaging in the projects and working through them. I am literally sharing information with you, explaining information to you, giving you examples, and then having you work through examples in order to help you be able to understand this information, make sense of it, and then hopefully be able to do some of it after you leave the class, or at least worst case scenario, remember it, right? If I left this so that it was solely just taking an exam or writing a research proposal, what would you be able to take away from it that you could potentially apply down the road? Or how could that feed into other research classes that you're going to have to take? This should be a jumping point for you where you leave with knowledge that you could use and that can be applied and built into other information that you're going to have to learn as you move forward. So I'm not just thinking about right now with you. I'm thinking about each step that you have to take after you leave me. Okay? So I hope this was helpful. Sorry it was super long. And if this was helpful, I am happy to do it again for other weeks. Do not feel like you have to watch these. If you feel like you're following along and everything is hunky-dory, that is perfectly fine. Otherwise, I'm happy to do whatever I need to do to try to help you all be successful. Research is hard. Research is complex. It's a lot to understand, to think about, and wrap your head around. And I'm trying something new with this class. So I'm stretching you. I'm scaffolding you as much as I can, according to Vygotsky's theory of learning. I'm stretching you beyond your prior background and understanding and knowledge, most of you. but I'm trying to scaffold and support you the entire time in order to ensure that you can learn and be successful. Okay? All right. If you need anything, I am always here for you. I am always available for a one-on-one if you do not have time to talk to me after class or you feel uncomfortable asking questions during class. I'm here for you. I will make time for you. Okay? All right. You all enjoy your weekend. Stay safe and judging from the roads, try to stay warm and dry.